The German soldier had prepared himself for the worst. Weeks of retreat, exhaustion carved into his face, uniform torn and stained with mud from the Italian campaign. Now, hands raised above his head, he shuffled forward with hundreds of other prisoners toward the American compound. His sergeant had warned them all, "If they take you alive, expect nothing but humiliation. These cowboys know nothing of honor, nothing of our culture. They'll treat you like animals because that's all they understand." The barbed wire loomed ahead, guard towers, searchlights. Everything looked exactly as he'd imagined American brutality would look. He braced himself for shouted commands in broken German, maybe a rifle butt to the ribs, certainly the kind of treatment he'd been told to expect from these uncultured barbarians. Instead, something happened that made his blood run cold. The American guard at the gate looked him directly in the eye and spoke. Not in English, not in broken, stammered German that any foreigner might attempt, but in clear, precise, unmistakably fluent German that carried the unmistakable accent of his own Saxon homeland. The soldier's knees nearly buckled. His mind reeled. This was impossible. Around him, other prisoners had gone silent. Some stared in disbelief, others whispered frantically to each other, convinced they were hallucinating from hunger and fatigue. A few simply stood frozen, their understanding of the world cracking open in real time. How could this American, this enemy soldier wearing the uniform of a nation an ocean away from Europe, speak German like someone who had grown up in the same villages they remembered from childhood? But that was just the beginning. Over the following days, as more prisoners arrived at camps across America, the same impossible scene repeated itself. Guards who didn't just speak German, but who understood every regional dialect, every piece of slang, every cultural reference that the prisoners thought would keep their conversations private. American soldiers who could quote Goethe, who knew the words to songs from Bavarian beer halls, who could crack jokes in Berlin street slang that would make even hardened Wehrmacht veterans laugh despite themselves. The psychological impact was devastating. These weren't the ignorant cowboys that Nazi propaganda had promised. These were people who seemed to understand German culture better than some Germans did. Thousands of prisoners would later describe this as the most unsettling moment of their entire war experience. Not the bombings, not the battles, not even the capture itself, but those first few words spoken in their mother tongue by people who were supposed to be their cultural inferiors. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what happened in those camps. You'll learn about America's most unusual secret weapon and why it left such a lasting mark on the men who experienced it. You'll discover a side of World War II that most history books never mention. But first, let me ask you to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps the algorithm share these forgotten stories with more people who are hungry for the real history behind the headlines. Because what you're about to learn changes everything you thought you knew about how wars are really won. To understand why this moment shattered so many German soldiers, you need to picture what they expected from American captivity. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted a very specific picture of their enemies across the Atlantic. Americans were cowboys and gangsters, uneducated farmers who had gotten lucky with industrial machinery, a nation of immigrants with no real culture, no appreciation for art, literature, or the finer aspects of European civilization. Most importantly, they were portrayed as people who could barely speak their own language properly, let alone understand the sophisticated depths of German culture. Dr. Joseph Goebbels had hammered this message home in countless radio broadcasts. These are not people who understand honor, tradition, or intellectual discourse. They are brutes who will treat you as they treat their own criminals, with violence and contempt. German soldiers had been drilled on what to expect if captured. Beatings were likely. Starvation was probable. Humiliation was guaranteed. The Geneva Convention existed on paper, but everyone knew Americans were too uncivilized to follow such diplomatic niceties. This wasn't just propaganda talking. It was what many Germans genuinely believed about American culture. Before the war, few Germans had much contact with Americans beyond Hollywood movies, which often reinforced stereotypes of crude frontiersmen and urban gangsters. The idea that Americans might possess deep cultural knowledge, let alone speak fluent German, seemed as unlikely as finding opera singers in a Wild West saloon. So when German prisoners began arriving on American soil in large numbers during 1943 and 1944, they came with very specific mental preparations. They steeled themselves for physical abuse. They prepared for linguistic isolation, endless confusion as guards barked incomprehensible commands in English. They expected to be treated like dangerous animals by people who saw them as nothing more than Nazi monsters. The numbers were staggering. By 1944, the United States held nearly 400,000 German prisoners of war, scattered across more than 500 camps from coast to coast. Texas alone housed over 50,000 prisoners. Wisconsin, Kansas, Oklahoma, states that most Germans couldn't even locate on a map, became temporary homes for soldiers who had never imagined they'd see American farmland. These camps sprang up with remarkable speed. The U.S. military had to quickly convert everything from abandoned CCC camps to hastily constructed barracks to handle the flood of prisoners coming from North Africa, Italy, and eventually France after D-Day. The logistics alone were mind-boggling. Feeding, housing, and guarding hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers while maintaining operations according to international law. The typical pattern was predictable. Prisoners would arrive exhausted, often after weeks in overcrowded transport ships. They'd be processed through intake procedures they couldn't understand, issued new clothing, assigned barracks, and introduced to camp routines that seemed designed around the assumption that they spoke no English and the guards spoke no German. Which made sense. Why would American guards speak German? Most had probably never left their home states before the war, let alone traveled to Europe. The logical expectation was that communication would happen through gestures, translators brought in occasionally for important matters, and the universal language of military discipline, which usually involved a lot of shouting and pointing. German officers, especially those from Prussian military families, had an additional layer of expectation. They anticipated not just linguistic barriers, but cultural ones. How could American guards, presumably drawn from farmers and factory workers, understand the concepts of military honor that had defined German officer training for generations? How could they grasp the subtle hierarchies, the unspoken codes, the traditions that separated common soldiers from their commanding officers? The prisoners often arrived in groups, maintaining whatever chain of command had survived their capture. Wehrmacht discipline held strong even in defeat. Officers continued to command, soldiers continued to obey. They expected this hierarchy to mean nothing to their American captors, who would likely treat generals and privates with equal contempt. But there were also practical expectations about daily life in the camps. Food would be poor and scarce. Americans probably ate nothing but beef and potatoes anyway, and wouldn't understand German dietary preferences. Entertainment would be non-existent. These culturally bankrupt people certainly wouldn't provide books, newspapers, or anything intellectually stimulating. Medical care would be minimal. Why waste good medicine on enemy prisoners? Most critically, the prisoners expected to live in a bubble of German-only conversation. Their private discussions, their complaints, their plans, their fears, all of this would remain safely locked away in a language their captors couldn't begin to comprehend. It was the one advantage they'd retain, the ability to speak freely among themselves, while the ignorant American guards stood by obliviously. This linguistic privacy was more than just practical. It was psychological armor. As long as they could communicate in their native tongue without being understood, they could maintain their identity, their dignity, and their sense of superiority over their captors. They might be prisoners in body, but their minds and voices would remain free. That assumption was about to be shattered in ways none of them could have imagined. What actually awaited them in those American camps would challenge everything they thought they knew about their enemies. about themselves, and about the very nature of the war they had been fighting. June 15th, 1944, Camp Hearn, Texas. The latest transport of German prisoners had just arrived after a grueling 3-day journey from the East Coast. Dust swirled around the trucks as they pulled through the main gate, carrying men who looked exactly as beaten down as every previous group, hollow-eyed, unshaven, resigned to whatever fate awaited them in this god-forsaken corner of America. Obergefreiter Hans Müller stepped down from the truck bed, his boots hitting Texas dirt for the first time. Around him, 200 other soldiers from the 352nd Infantry Division moved in the shuffling, defeated manner of men who had given up hope of seeing home again anytime soon. The July heat was already unbearable, and it wasn't even noon. Müller had mentally prepared himself for the usual routine. American guards would bark incomprehensible orders. There would be pointing, shoving, maybe some rough handling as they were processed through whatever bureaucratic nightmare the Americans had devised. He'd learned a few English phrases during his capture. Yes, sir. No, sir. Hungry. Figuring these might help him survive the worst of it. What he was not prepared for was the voice that cut through the noise of engines and shuffling feet. Achtung! Alle Gefangene bilden 3 Reihen. Schnell, aber ruhig. Wir haben nicht den ganzen Tag Zeit. The voice was clear, authoritative, and delivered with the precise pronunciation of someone who had grown up speaking German, not the halting, mispronounced German of a foreigner who had learned it from a book, but the natural, effortless German of a native speaker. Müller's head snapped up. Around him, the effect was instantaneous and electric. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Men who had been dragging their feet suddenly stood straighter, looking around wildly for the source of the voice. Some prisoners actually took several steps backward, as if they had encountered something supernatural. The voice belonged to a young American soldier, probably no more than 25, wearing the standard olive drab uniform with corporal stripes on his sleeve. He stood casually near the processing station, clipboard in hand, looking entirely ordinary except for one impossible detail. He was speaking perfect German with what sounded like a Rhineland accent. Was ist hier los? One prisoner whispered to another. What's happening here? But the whisper, quiet as it was, didn't go unnoticed. Ruhe jetzt, the American corporal said, turning toward the whispered conversation. Quiet now. I understand every word you're saying, so you might as well save your breath. If the first German command had caused surprise, this response caused something closer to panic. The realization hit the prisoners in waves. This American soldier hadn't just memorized a few phrases for processing prisoners. He was actually listening to their private conversations and understanding them completely. Müller felt his worldview tilting on its axis. This violated everything he had been told about Americans. They were supposed to be culturally ignorant, linguistically limited, incapable of understanding the sophisticated depths of European thought and language. Yet here was one of them not just speaking German, but speaking it with regional characteristics that suggested intimate familiarity with German culture. The processing continued, but the atmosphere had completely changed. Instead of the resigned confusion that typically marked these initial encounters, there was now a tense, electric awareness among the prisoners. Every casual comment, every muttered complaint, every quiet observation was suddenly potentially compromised. Mein Gott, an older sergeant whispered. They understand us. Nicht alle, another prisoner replied hopefully. Nur dieser eine. But that hope was quickly shattered as they moved through the various stations of the intake process. At the medical check, a different American, this one a private with sergeant stripes, conducted examinations while speaking fluent German with what sounded like a Bavarian accent. At the uniform distribution point, yet another German-speaking American soldier explained procedures in clear, unaccented German that could have come from any street corner in Berlin. By the time the prisoners were led to their barracks, Word had spread through the entire group like wildfire. The Americans didn't just have one or two soldiers who could speak a little German. They had entire staffs of native-level speakers positioned throughout the camp structure. That first night in the barracks, the conversations were unlike anything that had taken place in previous camps. Instead of the usual complaints about food, speculation about the war's progress, or nostalgic stories about home, the talk centered on one bewildering question. How was this possible? "They must have German prisoners working as translators," suggested one soldier. "No," replied another. "I saw their uniforms, their insignia. These are real American soldiers." Maybe they're German Americans who switched sides. That would make them traitors. But they're fighting for America. How can they be traitors to Germany if they're not German citizens? The questions multiplied faster than answers could be found. Some prisoners convinced themselves it was an elaborate psychological trick. Americans wearing German uniforms or somehow using captured German soldiers to impersonate American guards. Others wondered if these were German immigrants who had fled to America years before and were now being used against their homeland. What none of them could fully grasp yet was the scope of what they had encountered. This wasn't a single camp with a few unusual guards. Across the United States, in camps from Texas to Wisconsin, from California to New York, similar scenes were playing out, with thousands of newly arrived German prisoners. At Camp Forest in Tennessee, Wehrmacht officers found themselves being addressed by American lieutenants who quoted Clausewitz in the original German. At Camp McCain in Mississippi, prisoners discovered that their casual conversations about escape routes were being overheard and understood by guards who had seemed to be paying no attention. At Camp Shelby in Mississippi, German soldiers learned that even their regional jokes and hometown slang were completely transparent to their American captors. The psychological impact was profound and immediate. These prisoners had expected to maintain at least the dignity of private communication in their native language. That assumption, perhaps the last vestige of their sense of superiority over their captors, had been stripped away in the first hour of their American captivity. But this was only the beginning of revelations that would fundamentally alter how they understood both their enemies and themselves.
The answer to this mystery lay not in some elaborate wartime deception, but in the fundamental nature of America itself. What the German prisoners had encountered wasn't magic. It was the product of decades of immigration, careful planning, and a strategic insight that would reshape how intelligence wars were fought. By 1940, the United States was home to over 1.2 million people who had been born in Germany, plus millions more of German descent. Entire communities across Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Ohio, and Missouri conducted daily life primarily in German. German-language newspapers flourished in major cities. Lutheran and Catholic churches held services in German every Sunday. In some rural areas, children learned German before they learned English. This wasn't ancient history. These were vibrant, living communities with fresh connections to the homeland. Many families had emigrated in the 1920s and 1930s, fleeing economic hardship or, increasingly, political persecution. They brought with them not just the language, but current slang, regional dialects, cultural references, and intimate knowledge of German society that no textbook could provide. But the most crucial element in America's unexpected linguistic advantage came from a darker source. The refugees who had fled Nazi Germany as the regime tightened its grip on power. Starting in 1933, as Hitler's anti-Jewish laws began to take effect, thousands of German Jews sought refuge in America. By 1939, over 100,000 German-speaking refugees had found new homes across the United States. These weren't just any immigrants. They included professors, doctors, lawyers, engineers, and intellectuals who brought sophisticated understanding of German culture, politics, and society. Among them were young men who had grown up in Berlin, Munich, Hamburg, and Frankfurt. They knew the rhythms of German military life, the hierarchies of German society, and the cultural touchstones that defined German identity. They also had something else that made them invaluable to American intelligence: personal motivation to see the Nazi regime destroyed. The US military began recognizing this opportunity as early as 1940, long before America officially entered the war. The Military Intelligence Service, working quietly out of converted college campuses and military bases, started recruiting German speakers for a classified program that would later become known as the Ritchie Boys. Named after Camp Ritchie in Maryland, where much of the training took place. The recruitment process was both systematic and surprisingly informal. Intelligence officers combed through immigration records, looking for recent arrivals from German-speaking regions. They checked phone directories in cities with large German populations, searching for surnames that suggested German heritage. They reached out through German-American community organizations, churches, and cultural associations. But they also did something more direct. They simply asked. Flyers appeared in German-language newspapers, calling for volunteers who could serve their new country by using their native language skills. The response was overwhelming. Consider the profile of a typical recruit. Hans Berger, who had fled Vienna in 1938 after the Anschluss. His father had been a university professor, his mother from a family of merchants. Hans spoke High German, Austrian German, and could recognize regional dialects from across the German-speaking world. He was 22 years old, educated, and personally invested in seeing the Nazi regime that had destroyed his family's life brought to justice. Or take the case of Werner Stern, whose family had run a successful textile business in Dusseldorf until 1935, when new laws made it impossible for Jewish businesses to operate. Werner had arrived in New York in 1937, worked in a garment factory to support his parents, and jumped at the chance to use his background against the regime that had stolen his future. These men, along with thousands of others, were shipped to Camp Ritchie for intensive training that went far beyond language instruction. Yes, they practiced German conversation, refined their accents, and learned military terminology. But they also studied psychology, interrogation techniques, cultural analysis, and the subtle arts of extracting information without violence. The training was grueling. 12-hour days were standard. Students practiced not just speaking German, but thinking like Germans. Understanding the cultural references, the social hierarchies, the unspoken assumptions that shaped how German soldiers saw the world. They studied Nazi ideology not to believe it, but to recognize it and counter it. They also learned something crucial: how to use familiarity as a weapon. A shared joke could lower defenses faster than any threat. A casual reference to a German hometown could establish rapport that made secrets slip out naturally. The ability to understand not just words, but cultural context could turn interrogation from confrontation into conversation. By 1943, the program had produced thousands of graduates who were fluent in German language and culture, trained in intelligence techniques, and personally motivated to use their skills against the Nazi war machine. They were dispersed throughout the military, some sent to Europe as interrogators and intelligence officers, others kept stateside to handle the growing population of German prisoners. The ethical questions were complex and troubling. Many of these men were technically still German citizens when the war began, Their American naturalization hadn't been completed. They were being asked to use their mother tongue, their cultural identity, and their intimate knowledge of German society as weapons against people who might have been their neighbors just a few years earlier. Some struggled with this moral complexity. Letters and diary entries from the period reveal deep internal conflicts. Am I betraying my homeland or serving my new country? One recruit wrote to his sister. When I speak German to these prisoners, am I helping them feel less alone? Or am I manipulating them for military advantage? Others had no such doubts. These people destroyed my family, my home, my entire world, Werner Stern wrote in his memoir decades later. If I could use the language they tried to steal from me as a weapon against their war machine, I considered it justice. The program expanded rapidly as the war progressed and the prisoner population grew. By 1944, the US military had trained over 15,000 German-speaking personnel for various intelligence and prisoner management roles. They were stationed not just in combat zones, but throughout the domestic camp system that was processing hundreds of thousands of German POWs. What the German prisoners encountered in places like Camp Herne wasn't accident or coincidence. It was the result of years of careful planning and systematic recruitment. America had turned one of its greatest strengths, its diversity and immigrant heritage, into a strategic military advantage that the Wehrmacht had never anticipated. This revelation raises a question that still troubles historians today. Was this brilliant strategy or exploitation of vulnerable refugees? Were these men patriots using their skills to fight tyranny? Or were they being manipulated by their adoptive country to betray their cultural heritage? The answer depends on who you ask, and it cuts to the heart of fundamental questions about identity, loyalty, and the moral complexities of warfare itself.
The true genius of America's linguistic strategy revealed itself not in the initial shock of hearing German from American guards, but in the slow, methodical way it dismantled the psychological defenses that prisoners used to maintain their sense of identity and resistance. Daily life in the camps became a constant reminder that privacy was an illusion. When Obergefreiter Müller complained to his bunkmate about the quality of the morning coffee, using what he thought was safely obscure Bavarian slang, a passing guard casually replied, "Das Zeug schmeckt wie Dreck, aber es ist heiß und koffeinhaltig." The stuff tastes like dirt, but it's hot and has caffeine. The effect wasn't just embarrassment. It was a fundamental alteration of the prisoner's mental landscape. Every conversation, every muttered complaint, every whispered confidence became potentially compromised. The simple act of speaking their native language, which should have been a refuge of familiarity and comfort, transformed into a source of vulnerability. In traditional prisoner-of-war situations, language barriers created natural boundaries. Guards shouted incomprehensible orders. Prisoners responded with sullen compliance, and both sides retreated into the safety of their own linguistic worlds. But in the American camps, those boundaries dissolved completely. German prisoners found themselves living in a strange mirror world where their captors spoke like neighbors but wore enemy uniforms. The psychological techniques employed by the German-speaking guards were sophisticated and varied. Some used humor as a disarming weapon. Sergeant Karl Hoffmann, a refugee from Berlin who had joined the program in 1942, became legendary among prisoners at Camp Forest for his ability to diffuse tensions with precisely timed jokes that demonstrated intimate knowledge of German cultural references. When a group of Wehrmacht veterans tried to maintain rigid military hierarchy in the barracks, Hoffmann would intervene not with discipline, but with gentle mockery, delivered in perfect Berlin working-class dialect. Ach, komm schon, Jungs. Der Krieg ist vorbei. Hier sind wir alle gleich gefangen. Come on, boys. The war's over. Here we're all equally captured. The humor worked because it came from someone who clearly understood the cultural context completely. It wasn't the clumsy attempt of a foreigner trying to be friendly. It was the kind of gentle ribbing that might have come from a brother or old friend. And that familiarity made it impossible to dismiss or ignore. Other guards employed more subtle psychological pressure. They would demonstrate knowledge that went far beyond mere language competence. Lieutenant David Meyer, whose family had fled Frankfurt in 1936, could identify not just regional accents but specific neighborhoods within German cities. When a prisoner mentioned growing up near the Romerberg in Frankfurt, Meyer would casually reference the bakery on the corner of Braubachstrasse, the way the cathedral bells sounded on Sunday mornings, or the particular smell of the Zeal shopping district during Christmas season. For the prisoners, these displays of intimate cultural knowledge were deeply unsettling. How could their captors know these details? Had they been spying on German communities for years before the war? Were there American agents embedded in German cities, taking notes on daily life, memorizing the layouts of neighborhoods and the rhythms of civilian existence? The truth, that these guards were simply people who had grown up in those places before being forced to flee, was somehow both more innocent and more disturbing than fantasies about elaborate spy networks. It meant that Germany itself had been hollowed out, that pieces of authentic German culture now existed in exile, serving America against the homeland that had expelled them. But the most devastating psychological technique was the simplest: genuine understanding. Traditional interrogation relied on intimidation, pressure, and the creation of stress that would break down resistance. The German-speaking American interrogators often used the opposite approach. They created comfort. At the classified facility known as P.O. Box 1142, located at Fort Hunt in Virginia, high-value German prisoners found themselves sitting across from interrogators who offered them cigarettes, spoke in familiar dialects, and demonstrated genuine interest in their experiences. These weren't sessions of brutal questioning. They were conversations that felt startlingly normal. Hauptmann Wilhelm Brandt, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Italy, later wrote in his memoir about his interrogation experience. The American officer spoke to me in the same Swabian dialect my grandmother had used. He asked about my training, my squadron, my equipment, but in the way an old friend might ask about your work over a beer. Before I realized what was happening, I was telling him things I had sworn never to reveal. The technique worked because it didn't feel like betrayal. When someone speaks your language perfectly, understands your cultural references, and treats you with apparent respect, the natural human response is to reciprocate. The prisoners weren't being broken. They were being welcomed into conversations that felt safe and familiar. Some interrogators took this approach to extraordinary lengths. They would spend entire sessions discussing German literature, debating the merits of different regional cuisines, or sharing memories of places they had both known before the war. Only gradually, almost imperceptibly, would they steer these conversations toward military topics. The psychological impact extended beyond formal interrogations into every aspect of camp life. Guards who understood German could anticipate problems before they developed, intercept escape plans before they matured, and identify potential troublemakers through casual eavesdropping on conversations that prisoners assumed were private. But perhaps more importantly, the constant linguistic surveillance created an atmosphere of uncertainty that was more effective than any physical intimidation. Prisoners began policing their own conversations, moderating their complaints, and second-guessing their most casual interactions. The mere possibility that they were being understood at all times changed how they related to each other and to their circumstances. This had an unexpected side effect that troubled some observers. Many prisoners became genuinely grateful for the linguistic accommodation. After months of expecting to be treated as incomprehensible enemies, they found comfort in being able to communicate naturally with their captors. Some guards received letters years after the war from former prisoners, thanking them for small acts of kindness delivered in fluent German. The ethical implications were complex. Was this humane treatment that recognized the prisoner's basic humanity? Or was it sophisticated manipulation that exploited natural human needs for communication and understanding? The answer likely depended on the individual guard, the specific prisoner, and the particular circumstances of their interaction. What became clear over time was that the psychological impact went both ways. The German-speaking guards, many of them refugees who had lost families and communities to Nazi persecution, found themselves in the strange position of providing comfort to soldiers who had served the regime that destroyed their previous lives. Some struggled with feelings of betrayal, not of America, but of their own traumatic experiences. Others found a different kind of resolution. Werner Stern, the textile worker's son from Dusseldorf, wrote decades later, "Every time I spoke German to a prisoner with kindness instead of hatred, I felt like I was reclaiming something the Nazis had tried to steal from me. They had turned my language, my culture, my identity into weapons of persecution. In those camps, I was turning them back into tools of humanity." The prisoners, meanwhile, faced their own psychological reckoning. The comfortable conversations, the cultural familiarity, and the humane treatment forced them to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of their enemies and the justifications for the war they had fought. If Americans could speak German, understand German culture, and treat German prisoners with respect, then what did that say about the propaganda that had painted them as barbaric and ignorant? And if some of these guards were refugees who had fled Germany, what did that suggest about the society the prisoners had been defending? These questions would haunt many of the prisoners long after the war ended, creating psychological impacts that extended far beyond their time in captivity.
The psychological warfare extended far beyond interrogations and daily commands. Within months of the camp's establishment, something unprecedented began to emerge. Entire cultural ecosystems that blurred the lines between imprisonment and hospitality, between enemy treatment and cultural accommodation. By late 1943, many camps had developed elaborate recreational programs, libraries stocked with German books, newspapers, and magazines, theater groups performing German plays for audiences of prisoners and occasionally guards, musical ensembles playing everything from classical composers to folk songs from various German regions, educational classes where Wehrmacht sergeants could learn advanced mathematics or engineering from captured German professors. At Camp Concordia in Kansas, the cultural program became so sophisticated that it attracted attention from US military observers, who came to study what they initially assumed was an experiment in prisoner rehabilitation. What they found was something more complex: a parallel German society operating within American territory, supervised and facilitated by guards who understood German culture intimately. The key to this cultural flowering wasn't just American tolerance. It was the active participation of German-speaking staff, who could serve as cultural interpreters and facilitators. When prisoners wanted to organize a performance of Schiller's Die Räuber, they didn't have to explain the cultural significance to bewildered American administrators. The camp's education officer, himself a refugee from Munich who had studied German literature before fleeing in 1938, could appreciate both the artistic merit and the potential political implications of the play. This created an atmosphere that was simultaneously comforting and unsettling for the prisoners. On one hand, they could maintain connections to their cultural identity in ways that traditional captivity would never have allowed. On the other hand, the very ease of this cultural accommodation reminded them constantly that their captors understood German civilization perhaps better than they had expected. The camp newspapers became particularly significant battlegrounds for cultural influence. These publications, written by prisoners but censored by German-speaking staff, became forums for debates about German identity, the nature of the war, and the future of their homeland. The censors' deep understanding of German political discourse meant that subtle propaganda attempts were caught quickly, but it also meant that genuine cultural expression was recognized and often allowed to flourish. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, captured in Normandy, later wrote about his experience editing the camp newspaper at Fort Devens. The American censor understood German political writing better than some of our own editors back home. He would catch coded references to Nazi ideology that I hadn't even noticed, but he would also appreciate subtle literary allusions that showed real cultural sophistication. It was maddening and impressive at the same time. The mail censorship system revealed similar complexities. Every letter home was read by German-speaking staff who understood not just the literal content, but the cultural context of what prisoners were trying to communicate. Family relationships, regional loyalties, religious references, political attitudes, all of these were transparent to censors who had grown up within the same cultural framework. This created unexpected moments of human connection across the prison camp divide. When a young prisoner received news that his girlfriend had married someone else, the censor, himself a refugee who had lost contact with his own fiancée when he fled Germany, quietly allowed through some language that technically violated regulations because he understood the emotional weight of the situation. But the system also enabled sophisticated psychological pressure. Letters describing the hardships faced by families in bombed German cities were sometimes shared among camp staff as evidence for discussions about the futility of continued German resistance. Prisoners' expressions of doubt about Nazi ideology, captured in what they thought were private communications home, were sometimes used to identify candidates for more intensive re-education programs. The educational initiatives presented the most complex ethical questions. Many camps offered advanced coursework taught by captured German academics, but the American administration ensured that the curriculum included exposure to democratic principles, critical thinking about authoritarian systems, and honest discussions of Nazi war crimes. The German-speaking administrators could navigate these sensitive topics in ways that monolingual Americans never could have managed. They understood which arguments would resonate with different types of German prisoners, which cultural references would make democratic ideals more accessible, and which approaches might backfire by seeming too heavy-handed or propagandistic. Lieutenant Robert Stern, the former Dusseldorf textile worker's son, developed a particularly effective approach at Camp Carson in Colorado. Rather than directly criticizing Nazi ideology, he organized seminars on German philosophical traditions that predated the Nazi movement, Kant's writings on moral autonomy, Hegel's discussions of human dignity, and Schopenhauer's critiques of nationalism. By engaging prisoners with their own intellectual heritage, he could encourage them to question authoritarian principles without seeming to attack their cultural identity. This approach raised fundamental questions about the nature of cultural identity and political loyalty. Were these German-speaking Americans preserving German culture or co-opting it for American purposes? Were they offering prisoners genuine intellectual freedom or sophisticated indoctrination disguised as cultural accommodation? Different prisoners answered these questions differently. Some appreciated the cultural programs as evidence that Americans, despite being enemies, could respect German achievements in art, literature, and philosophy. Others saw the same programs as insidious attempts to separate German culture from German political identity, to make them love their homeland's traditions while rejecting their homeland's government. The complexity deepened when prisoners began to realize that many of their most culturally knowledgeable guards were refugees who had been forced to flee Germany. These men could discuss German poetry, German music, and German philosophy with genuine passion and deep knowledge. But they could also speak with personal authority about the human costs of Nazi policies. For many prisoners, encountering these refugee guards became an education in the internal contradictions of the society they had been defending. How could someone who clearly loved German culture and spoke German with native fluency also oppose the German government so completely? The answer to that question would force many prisoners to reconsider fundamental assumptions about the relationship between culture, politics, and national identity. Think about this complexity for a moment. If you found yourself in a foreign prison where the guards understood your culture better than you expected, facilitated your cultural expressions, but also used that cultural knowledge to challenge your political beliefs, how would you respond? Would you see it as respect for your heritage or manipulation of your identity?
Behind the strategic calculations and psychological techniques were individual human beings whose lives had been shattered by history and reshaped by circumstances none of them could have imagined. The daily interactions between German-speaking guards and prisoners created relationships that defied the simple categories of captor and captive, enemy and ally. Take the story of Jakob Rosenberg, who had fled Berlin in 1937 when his family's small publishing business was destroyed by anti-Jewish legislation. By 1944, he was Sergeant Rosenberg of the US Army, stationed at Camp Shelby in Mississippi, responsible for managing the camp library and educational programs for German prisoners. Among the prisoners was Lieutenant Hans Kruger, a young officer from Bremen who had been captured in the Normandy fighting. Kruger had grown up 2 streets away from the Rosenberg family's old printing shop. His father had been one of their regular customers, ordering wedding invitations and business cards throughout the 1920s. The recognition was mutual and immediate. When Kruger saw Rosenberg during library orientation, he stared for several seconds before speaking in careful, hesitant German. Entschuldigung, aber kennen wir uns nicht? Sie sind doch der Sohn vom Drucker Rosenberg, oder? Excuse me, but don't we know each other? You're the son of Rosenberg, the printer, aren't you? The conversation that followed was unlike anything either man had expected from wartime captivity. They spoke of shared memories. The way snow looked on the Weser River in winter. The smell of fresh bread from the bakery on Butcherstrasse. The sound of ship horns from the harbor that had wakened both of them on countless mornings. But they also had to navigate the painful reality of what had happened to the world they had both known. Kruger, with visible discomfort, eventually asked what had become of the Rosenberg family business. Jakob's answer was quiet but direct. Kristallnacht, 1938.
They burned it down, along with most of the other Jewish shops on our street. My parents left for America 3 months later. The exchange left both men shaken. For Kruger, it was a personal encounter with the consequences of policies he had supported, or at least accepted. For Rosenberg, it was a confrontation with someone who represented the society that had expelled his family, but who also carried memories of a time when that same society had been their home. Similar encounters occurred throughout the camp system. At Camp Forest in Tennessee, Private David Stern found himself guarding Ernst Weber, who had attended the same gymnasium in Frankfurt that David's older brother had graduated from before the family emigrated. They discovered they had both played in the same youth soccer league, though for opposing teams. At Camp McCain in Mississippi, Corporal Ruth Mayer, one of the few female German-speaking staff members, interviewed prisoners for work assignments and discovered that one of them, Feldwebel Anton Fischer, had worked as a mechanic in the garage next to her father's jewelry shop in Hamburg. Fischer remembered her as a little girl who used to watch him repair bicycles through the workshop window. These personal connections created impossible emotional dynamics. The guards carried intimate knowledge not just of German language and culture, but of specific places, people, and experiences that connected them directly to individual prisoners. The prisoners found themselves face to face with people who represented both their enemies and their own displaced past. The psychological impact on the guards was profound and often difficult to bear. Many had fled Germany to escape persecution, carrying trauma from the loss of family members, businesses, and entire communities. Now they found themselves in positions of authority over men who had served the regime responsible for that persecution. Some guards channeled their pain into stern but fair treatment that emphasized the moral differences between democratic and authoritarian systems. Sergeant Karl Hoffmann, the Berlin refugee, became known for delivering lectures about constitutional rights and democratic governance that were informed by his personal experience of losing those protections. Others struggled with conflicted feelings that made their duties emotionally exhausting. Lieutenant Werner Stern wrote in his diary, "Today I helped a prisoner write a letter to his mother in Düsseldorf, describing his treatment here and assuring her he was safe. His mother lives 3 blocks from where my own mother was born. How do I reconcile kindness toward him with my memories of what his country did to my family?" The prisoners faced equally complex emotional challenges. Many had been indoctrinated to believe that Jews, political dissidents, and other refugees were traitors to German culture. Now they found themselves dependent on these same people for basic communication, cultural accommodation, and humane treatment. Some prisoners responded with grudging respect that gradually evolved into genuine appreciation. Hauptmann Weber, the Luftwaffe pilot, later wrote, "Sergeant Rosenberg could have treated us with the hatred we probably deserved. Instead, he helped us maintain our dignity while gently showing us what German culture could look like without Nazi poison. It was the most effective education I received during the war." Others maintained bitter resentment, even while accepting the practical benefits of having guards who understood them. A group of SS officers at Camp Alva in Oklahoma created a clandestine newsletter that referred to the German-speaking guards as Verräter, traitors, and Judenschweine, a Nazi anti-Semitic slur. When the newsletter was discovered by guards who understood every word, the confrontation was heated and personal, in ways that purely linguistic barriers might have prevented. The most complex relationships developed when guards and prisoners discovered they had lost people in the same places during the same events. At Camp Concordia, a guard whose family had been killed during Kristallnacht found himself counseling a prisoner whose brother had died in the RAF bombing of Hamburg. Both men had lost family members to the violence of the war, but from opposite sides of the conflict. These encounters forced both guards and prisoners to confront the human cost of the ideologies they had supported or opposed. The guards had to balance their personal trauma with their professional responsibilities and their commitment to humane treatment. The prisoners had to reconcile their understanding of these individuals as enemies with their growing recognition of them as people who had suffered from the same historical forces, just from different positions. The relationships that developed defied simple categorization. They were shaped by shared culture and divided loyalty, by personal history and political conflict, by human compassion and institutional duty. Some guards and prisoners developed what could only be called friendships, despite the circumstances that had brought them together. Others maintained respectful but distant professional relationships that acknowledged their shared humanity while respecting their opposed positions. These personal stories reveal something crucial about the nature of the American linguistic strategy. It wasn't just about extracting information or maintaining order. It created opportunities for the kind of human connection that could challenge fundamental assumptions about identity, loyalty, and the meaning of citizenship itself.
The question these relationships posed was profound. When language, culture, and personal history connect you to someone, but politics and war have made you enemies, which bonds are stronger? For both the guards and the prisoners, finding answers to that question would shape their understanding of themselves long after the war had ended. The end of the war brought a peculiar kind of farewell to the American prisoner camps. Between 1945 and 1946, as Germany lay in ruins and the world began the long process of reconstruction, hundreds of thousands of German prisoners prepared for repatriation to a homeland many barely recognized. The partings were unlike any that had occurred in previous conflicts. Guards and prisoners who had spent years navigating the complex terrain between friendship and duty, between cultural connection and political opposition, now faced permanent separation. Some goodbyes were formal and brief, professional acknowledgements between former adversaries. Others carried emotional weight that surprised everyone involved. At Camp Shelby, Jakob Rosenberg shook hands with Hans Kruger, the young lieutenant from Bremen who had recognized him from their shared neighborhood. They exchanged addresses, though both understood that the Germany Kruger was returning to bore little resemblance to the one they had both remembered. Vielleicht sehen wir uns eines Tages in besseren Zeiten wieder, Kruger said quietly. Perhaps we'll see each other again in better times. The psychological impact of these relationships extended far beyond the camps themselves. For many German prisoners, the experience of encountering German-speaking American guards had fundamentally altered their understanding of identity, loyalty, and the meaning of homeland. They returned to Germany carrying questions that Nazi propaganda had never prepared them to ask. If Germans could be Americans, if German culture could flourish outside of German political control, if people who loved German literature and music could oppose the German government, then what did it truly mean to be German? These questions would haunt the process of rebuilding German society in ways that historians are still trying to understand. The Guards carried their own lasting impacts. Many continued their military service, using their linguistic skills in the occupation of Germany and later in intelligence work during the Cold War. Others returned to civilian life, but found themselves forever changed by their encounters with men who had served the regime that had destroyed their families' previous lives. Werner Stern, the textile worker's son from Düsseldorf, spent decades after the war working as a translator for international humanitarian organizations. He often spoke of his camp service as the experience that taught him the difference between people and the governments they serve. Those prisoners weren't monsters, he wrote in his memoir. They were men who had been caught up in something larger and more terrible than they understood. Teaching me that distinction may have been the most important education of my life.
The strategic implications of America's linguistic weapon extended far beyond World War II. The success of the German-speaking program influenced intelligence services around the world, demonstrating that cultural knowledge could be as valuable as technical intelligence. Modern interrogation techniques, psychological operations, and cultural warfare strategies all trace their lineage partly to those experimental programs in American prisoner camps. But the moral questions raised by this strategy remain unresolved. Was it humane treatment that recognized the prisoner's basic humanity, or sophisticated manipulation that exploited natural human needs for communication and cultural connection? The answer likely varies depending on the individual circumstances, the specific people involved, and the broader context of their interactions. What's certain is that the program revealed something profound about the nature of warfare itself. Traditional military thinking focused on breaking the enemy's will through physical force, economic pressure, and psychological intimidation.
The American camps demonstrated that understanding your enemy's culture and speaking his language could be more effective than any of these conventional approaches. The German prisoners' experience also illuminated the complex relationship between culture and politics that defines modern identity. The guards who spoke perfect German while wearing American uniforms embodied a truth that nationalist ideologies have always found threatening: that cultural heritage and political loyalty are not the same thing. That love for a language or tradition doesn't require support for a particular government or regime. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of this forgotten chapter of World War II is its reminder that human connections can transcend the political categories that divide us. Language, shared memories, cultural references, and common experiences create bonds that persist even when people find themselves on opposite sides of conflicts they never chose. The next time you hear a foreign language spoken perfectly by someone who clearly isn't from that country, remember the German prisoners who heard their mother tongue from American guards. Remember the Jewish refugees who used their native language to serve their adopted homeland against the regime that had expelled them. Remember the complicated relationships that developed between people who should have been nothing more than enemies. These stories matter because they remind us that identity is more complex than politics, that culture belongs to everyone who carries it, and that understanding your enemy doesn't make you weaker, it makes you wiser.
So, what do you think about America's secret linguistic weapon? Was it brilliant strategy, ethical treatment, sophisticated manipulation, or all of these things at once? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more hidden stories from history that challenge everything you thought you knew about war, identity, and the human connections that persist, even in the darkest of times.